Hello. It's good to see you. Today I'm going to read you some stories from people who lived, back. A lot of these people lived back or born back in the early 1900s. There aren't really many pictures to look at, and a lot of the pictures in the book are kind of blurry anyway. So you don't really need to try to look at what I'm reading because it's mostly, you don't need to try to read along. You'll give yourself a headache, and we don't need that. So you can just listen. I'm going to read to you some of the tales of people's lives back in the early 1900s. The title of this first story is Hiding from the Raleigh Salesman by Doris Russell Dennis. I was the fifth child of 6 born to John S. Russell and Sally Mae Manus Russell in the Shady Grove community, which is about 8 miles north of Troy between Okiewimi and Black Ankle. I was born in 1932 during the Depression, and with 4 other children before me, we had to work hard to raise our own food. When I was 6 years old, we got another baby sister, Betty. Our house was rather small and was heated with fireplaces and a wood heater. The wood cooking stove in the kitchen kept the kitchen warm in the winter and hot in the summer when Mama was canning vegetables and fruits. I have a lot of good memories of my early childhood. We did not have any toys like kids do today, so we had to make up our own fun. I remember walking out in the woods around the house and making playhouses. We would sweep out a place in the woods around the house and outline the rooms with big rocks. Then we made pretend beds out of the moss and chairs out of small rocks. I would dare my sisters or brother to set foot in my pretty house. On Sunday afternoon, sometimes one of the neighbors would come visit with their children, and we would play hopscotch, or if we had a rubber ball, we really had fun throwing it over the house to someone on the other side. We had no electricity or indoor plumbing. Oil lamps were the only light we had. We had to go to bed real early anyway because Daddy had to get up about 4:30 a.m. to start the fires in the heater and fireplace, and Mama had to milk the cows, cook breakfast, and get 6 kids ready for school. The school bus came on the main Okiewimi Road, and we had to walk from our house up to Brack Martin's store to meet it, which was about a mile or more. During the winter, it was really cold walking that mile or so and then waiting for the bus. My dad was a carpenter and painter, and he also farmed to raise our corn and wheat crops. We had cows for milk and butter, raised our own hogs, and had chickens for eggs. Mama always had a large garden and canned all kinds of vegetables for winter. Brack and Edith Martin were our closest neighbors, and Brack's little store was where we had to meet the school bus. He had all kinds of candy in the store, sold kerosene oil for our lamps, and had staple goods. I remember wishing every day that I had a nickel or a penny for a piece of candy, but I very seldom did. I remember in the summer, my sister Aileen and I would walk over to Frank and Pearl Hewlin's down by the river, where he had a roller mill, and go swimming. Nancy Hewlin was Aileen's best friend because they were the same age and went to school together. We had 2 mules, Molly and Hannah, and a wagon. Daddy would put straw in the wagon, and we would all crawl in the back and ride to church or to visit neighbors. When Daddy got a T-model car, and many years later, then Daddy got a T-model car, and many years later an A-model. I must have been 10 or 12 years old then, and we were the envy of all the neighbors. I broke my leg and had to stay in the hospital 3 or 4 months, and every week Daddy drove that A-model to Gastonia to see me. How happy I was to look out my hospital window and see that A model coming around the curve. It probably took Daddy all day to get there. I remember Mr. Schenkel, the Raleigh product salesman, would come to our house to sell salve and flavorings. Sometimes, if Mama saw him coming and she didn't want to buy anything, she would gather up all us children and hide in a back bedroom or down in the edge of the woods until he left. She would pop our mouths if we dared to make a sound. When I was around 15, Daddy sometimes let me drive his A model to church. One homecoming Sunday, with all the picnic tables set up, the brakes didn't work for me, and I knocked down several tables. Daddy yelled at me and said, "Why didn't you just turn the switch off?" I was heartbroken because Daddy was mad at me. The next day when Daddy was coming home from work, he ran into the well house. I ran out the back door and asked him why he didn't turn the switch off. "By gabs," he said, "I guess the brakes don't work right." During the summer, we had to chop the grass out of the field of corn and also the huge garden. Then I remember when I was in high school, I got a job at a peach orchard. I had to stay with one of my girlfriends in Troy because otherwise I would have no way to get to work. My girlfriend also worked at the peach orchard, and a truck would come by her house and pick us up every morning and bring us home that night. We made 50 cents an hour, which was wonderful back then. And my mom used to do the same thing every summer when she was in high school. She would pack peaches. They would bring around a truck and pick up kids that wanted to work and take them to the orchard. And they'd work all day and then take them home at night. I used to meet the mailman up at Bragg Martin's store, and sometimes he would let me ride down to Laura Cochran's to play with Katie Jane, her daughter. I remember one day we were out in the barn playing and accidentally let a little calf out. We ran that calf all over the pasture trying to get it back in before Laura found out. But she saw us, and boy, did we ever get a tongue lashing for trying to quote-unquote kill that little calf. I remember when it was hog killing time. Preparations had to be made real early, getting home from school. Getting the water hot and everything. The neighbors always came over to help. When I would come home from school, the kitchen would be knee-deep in hog meat, with all the neighbor wives helping to cut up lard meat and meat to grind up into sausage. Mama would have a big fire going all around the old black wash pot out in the backyard, and the fat pork was put in the pot to cook all the fat out to make the lard. Of course, the cracklins were kept for crackling cornbread. In the late afternoon, when the women helping were ready to go, Mama would give them all some fresh pork tenderloin to take home with them. Always in the morning for breakfast, Mama made hot biscuits and fried that fresh tenderloin or sausage. Nothing was wasted from those hogs. The liver was made into liver pudding. The stomach, and I don't know what else, was made into souse meat. I also remember Mama and my older sisters, Lavina, Lucille, and Aileen, taking the chitlins down to the branch running behind our house and cleaning them. I don't think I ever ate any of those, though. The hams, shoulders, and side meat were salted down and hung in the tobacco barn to cure. Needless to say, those hams were delicious when Mama would finally cut one. As I said before, we had no electricity or indoor plumbing. The outhouse was between our house and the barn, and during the winter it was pretty cold going out there. We used old, outdated Sears Roebuck catalogs for toilet paper. Mama always had a large tub or barrel under the downspout to catch rainwater for bathing. To keep the milk cool, we had a spring about a half-mile from the house, and the jars of milk were kept there. That was one of our chores, to go to the spring and bring back buckets of water for drinking and cooking, and before supper every night, to go get the milk from the spring. Of course, there was always a lot of fussing between us as to whose turn it was to go to the spring. Also, Mama would keep some of the milk and pour it in crocks. Then she would skim the cream off the top once it was soured. She would put this cream in a half-gallon jar, and we would have to sit and shake the jar until the butter separated from the milk. The buttermilk was then used to make biscuits and cornbread. I remember we were so happy to get an old ice box, and the iceman would come every week to bring us a block of ice. How wonderful it was to be able to take an ice pick and get a cup of ice to put in our milk or water into. Then sometime later, we got a well dug, and that was wonderful too. It had the bucket on the end of a rope, which we would let down in the well until it hit the water and fill up. Then we would wind it up and empty the bucket of water into another bucket to use in the house. As I said before, Daddy farmed and had huge fields of wheat and corn. When he would come home from his carpentry jobs, he would hitch up our mules, Molly and Hannah, and plow that big field out in front of our house. Then I remember Lester Singleton coming to clean out the cow and mule stables and haul that manure and spread it out over the fields. Most of the time, Lester would let me ride on the back of the wagon. He still talks about it today, saying I made him stop every few feet to pick wildflowers. The cornfield was usually out in front of our house, and we children would have to chop the grass out of the rows of corn, and believe me, the rows looked to be about a mile long. When it was time to gather the corn in the fall, Daddy would take Molly and Hannah to pull the wagon to put the corn in. It was then piled in a huge long pile, and we would start getting ready for the annual corn shucking when all the neighbors for miles around were invited to help shuck the corn. Of course, Mama and all the neighbor women were busy days ahead making pies and cakes, and on the appointed day cooking a large meal for the corn shuckers. It was so exciting when we girls got a little older. I was probably 13 or 14, and we would help shuck corn, and if by chance we found a red ear of corn, that meant we would get a kiss from one of the young boys there. I remember in the spring going with Mama through the woods to a cow pasture belonging to a neighbor to pick blackberries and having to watch out for the bulls so we could run and get over the fence before they saw us. My brother, John Lewis, and I were always fighting and chasing each other around. I guess because we were closer to the same age. I think Aileen and Lucille fussed a lot too, but we were never spanked or got a whipping. I remember Daddy saying he spanked Lavina, my oldest sister, once, and it hurt him more than it hurt her, and he would never switch any of us again. I met my husband, Carson Dennis, when I was in 7th grade in school. He was my first and only real boyfriend. We courted all through school, and because he didn't have a car, his brother or a friend used to drive him out to my house on Saturday night. However, most of the time they would forget to come back after him, and he would have to walk the 8 miles back to Troy where he lived. He still talks about the bobcats and screech owls, and he was so afraid he would run most of the way home. He had to slip through a bedroom window when he got home because if his dad woke up, Carson would get a beating. We got married a few months after I finished high school, and we lived with Daddy and Mama for a while since we could not afford an apartment. Carson worked the second shift at Smitherman Cotton Mills, and I worked at Wood's 5 and 10 cent store uptown. After a while, we did get a basement apartment in Troy. We sure ate a lot of pinto beans and potatoes because we could not afford anything else. We got married in 1950 in South Carolina. We came back from South Carolina and went up towards Sanford to a motel for one night. That was our honeymoon. Our first years together were very hard because neither of us made much money. After 2 years of marriage, Steve was born, and then 4 years later, Diane. Carson's mother used to keep the children for us while we worked. By then, Carson was working for Primo and King Printers, and I worked for the welfare department for a while and then worked for Horace McCall, attorney. After moving to Pinehurst in 1960, Robert was born in 1965. We are both retired now. My husband sold his printing business, and I retired from Branch Banking and Trust Company after 35 years in the banking business here in Pinehurst. I am very active in my church, Coldy Presbyterian Church. Having retired as a trust officer, I had worked with the elderly customers so many years. Now my time is spent visiting those customers and others in nursing homes or at their homes, helping with financial matters such as balancing bank statements, helping them pay their bills, and so forth. I enjoy this very much. My husband's hobby is playing golf, and living in the golf capital of the world, he is also happy. Our parents died in the late 60s, and one sister, Lucille, died about 4 years ago. However, we are still a close-knit family. Every year we have a Russell reunion, and all the sisters and brother with their extended families gather together at the Shady Grove Community Building to reminisce, eat, and celebrate the fact that we are all members of the Russell family. One year my brother cleaned out the path to the spring where we used to get our water. It was so much fun to walk down through those woods again to the spring and reminisce about all the good times we used to have, and of course, all the fussing and fighting about whose turn it was to go get the milk and water. And that is the end of that story. The next story I have for you is titled Catalogs for Toilet Paper by Jenny Dunn. I was born at home on December 4th, 1918 in Pageland, South Carolina. I was delivered by a midwife. All children were delivered by a midwife. Well, maybe she means in her family, but not literally everywhere. My parents were Benjamin Frederick Bailey and Myrtle Alice Bailey. My dad worked at a sawmill, and my mother was a housewife. There were 5 children in my family. Other than me, there were John, Fannie Mae, Alice, and Elizabeth. When I was a child, life was very much different from today. We lived in old houses and had no water inside. We had no lights. We used outdoor toilets and catalogs for toilet paper. We had wood heaters and cooked on wood stoves. You had to cut wood for the heater and stove to cook with. Sometimes we had to carry water a long way. We had a dipper or a gourd to drink from. We used kerosene lamps for lights. We took a bath in a wash tub, and we washed clothes on a washboard and boiled white ones in the wash pot. We heated irons on the stove to iron clothes back in those days. We cut all the grass out of the yard and swept it clean with a yard broom made from dogwood tops. We scrubbed the floor with the shuck mop. If you had a cold, you had to take castor oil. We lived in South Carolina and North Carolina. My job was to wash dishes by hand. My father had a car. He used it for work, and on Saturdays we went to town to get food. Children back then didn't have cars to drive, for there was no work for them to do. We always picked cotton in the fall to get some clothes. My mother always made dresses for the girls to wear. You could buy cloth for 10 cents a yard. We always went to my grandmother's for the corn shucking. They had wheat threshing in the summer. The women always done a lot of cooking. My first job was when I helped a lady with her washing and ironing, and she gave me things for helping her. My second job was in Troy at a place where they canned beef. I made 25 cents an hour. After that, I worked in McGee in a sewing room and made clothes they give to people. I met my husband, Ted Dunn, at his home. I got along with his parents. I did not have a honeymoon. Years back then were very hard. You didn't have much to live on, for there were no jobs. It will soon be that way again. My children are Charlie Franklin and Bobby Pete and Nancy Carroll. I went to work at United Mills in McGee, North Carolina, where I sewed. I worked there 45 years. Then they went out of business. I am retired, but I wish I could work somewhere. It is so lonely sitting at home all the time. I like to sew and make things. I sew at home some. If you know of a sewing job, send it to me. I have one grandchild and 2 great-grandchildren. What would make me the happiest is for my oldest son to get well, and also my other son. They are both disabled to work. My oldest son has a lung problem, and the other has Parkinson's. Oh, that's sad. And then the next story is titled The Baby on the Hot Stove by Virginia Dennis Norris Elder. I was born at home, as were my 2 brothers, David and Carson, and 2 sisters, Jane and Nancy. I was delivered by Dr. Thompson on January 4th, 1930. I grew up in Troy, where I was born. My parents were Anderson J. Dennis and Sadie Norden Dennis. My father was a shipping clerk at Smitherman Cotton Mill, and my mother was a homemaker. I loved to go to Grandma Norden's house because there were so many things to do, like pick blackberries and bring them in and eat some right then with milk and sugar. I liked going with Grandma to stake the cow in a field to graze all day, and we would go back and get her late in the evening. Sometimes we would stop by and visit with a friend. I can't remember the name, but her yard was so shady and we were so hot. It was such a pleasant relief. I was also able to walk through the woods to my friend Yvonne Van Cannon's house. It was a beautiful place to walk. I think it was a pasture, and it had a little creek we played in. Clothes washing day was fun, but not for Grandma. We would take the clothes to the spring and build a fire under the wash pot and boil the clothes. Aunt Cora and Uncle John Morris lived with Grandma, and I remember Aunt Cora being so sweet and let us do anything we wanted. I was always a little homesick the first night, but Aunt Cora would wink at me from across the table at supper time, and that made everything all right. McCallum's Pond in Candor was a fun place to go swimming. We loved to go on a picnic after church to a graveyard in McGee. I can't remember the name of it, but it was on a hill and the view was beautiful. Miss Jo Allen was such a good person to have known as a child. She was a BTU leader at First Baptist Church. Also, Hope Howell Hodge was our leader in our teen years and was such a good role model for us. We had a car, but walked almost everywhere we went except to Grandpa Dennis's on Sundays. He lived about 10 miles away. When I became a teenager, my friends and I would walk around town on Sunday afternoon. One Sunday, we rode to Grandpa's house and walked this 10 miles back home. We stopped at Susan Russell's house, and her mother served us chocolate cake and sour pickles. I have never heard of that combination, but it was delicious. We lived in a mill house. Smitherman Cotton Mill provided houses for their employees until 1953, when we moved across the road to what was known as the Dunn House. When Mr. and Mrs. Dunn lived there, they had a cow that grazed in the fields. It was a beautiful place, about 3 acres, with pretty shrubbery, magnolia trees, and Mrs. Dunn's beautiful flowers. It was our delight as children to take corn shucks for the cow to eat and bring home an armload of gladiolas or zinnias. Each visit was like being in another world, and that feeling stayed with me for a long time afterward, and I can even remember it today. Mama had her own flower garden, although small, in which she grew larkspur and sweet william, among other beautiful flowers. We always had a large vegetable garden which Daddy worked in from the time he got home from the mill till dark. He was so particular about the way it had to be chopped that we children were not allowed to help most of the time. We could bring buckets of water, but had the fear of his wrath if we stepped in the wrong place. Daddy always, in cold weather, got up first and made a fire in the stove in the kitchen and in the small grate in the living-bedroom. I have a brother 14 months older than I, and on this particular morning we were both very small. Daddy made his fires and then picked up my brother and me, one in each arm, and took us into the kitchen so that Mama could get dressed. In the kitchen, he bent down to put my brother on the floor, and at the same time sat me on the hot stove. I don't remember this incident, but am sure he never forgot it. The John Ledbetter family lived next door to us, and Mary Frances was my best friend. There were 6 children in that family, and they lost their mother when they were quite young. I remember that being a sad time, but was too young to understand fully the impact of her death on that family until I was much older. Granny came to live with them, and I remember her making fried sweet potato slices in a biscuit. They were so good, and I remember wishing my grandmother lived with us. Several years later, Mary Frances and I were about 12 years old and had, for some reason, a little misunderstanding. I was upset about the breakup, but didn't know how to patch it up, so I just hung around in my backyard watching as Mary Frances made a playhouse in their flower garden. It was not a house, but just a space separated by make-believe lines. Pretty soon, I saw a little table and chairs go in the play area, and then my other good friend, Janelle Sedberry, was invited to Mary's party, and of all things, Mary served those delicious biscuits with fried sweet potato slices. I'm sure I was drooling, but was not invited to join them. We were best of friends a short time later. I don't know what caused our rift, but I do know I was careful after that to be on my best behavior. All of the neighborhood kids played softball in the Ledbetter front yard, and what good memories that brings up. I was the last one chosen by either side because I couldn't hit the ball. The only reason I was picked at all was with understanding that someone else would take my third strike and I could run. We would play till we were called in for supper, and went then reluctantly. The smell of wood burning in a wood stove or leaves burning in the autumn always reminds me of those good old days. There was a little store across the road from us that was run by Mr. Mills and his son, where we would go when we had a penny and get 2 suckers, which were 2 for a penny and had a sucker on each end of the stick. They were so good, and if we were lucky enough to get a nickel, we might get an orange crush in a big bottle. I can still taste them today. Other than softball, we spent a lot of time roller skating. At first, I would have to borrow one skate from a friend and just skate on one skate. I begged and begged for a pair of skates of my own, but with 5 children wanting the same thing, we were told that we couldn't get them. Imagine my surprise when one day after school there was a package from Sears Roebuck, and in it the most beautiful pair of skates I had ever seen. I skated all over town. My favorite place to skate was at the courthouse because it was level and smooth. I remember troops of soldiers passing our house during World War II in convoy. They would throw us their addresses. I remember Mama heating pots of water on the wood stove for our Saturday night bath. I remember working at Belk's store on Friday evening and all day Saturday. I made $1.48 after taxes for those 2 days. I was 6 years old when my sister Nancy was born. I'll never forget when I came downstairs that morning, and there in the bed with Mama was a baby. I was so excited, but Mama said, "What will we do with her? We have 4 children already, and we don't need her, do we? I wonder if Aunt Grace would take her." I failed to see the snickers going on behind my back and thought Mama was serious. Later that morning, I left the house on a mission to see if I could help Mama get rid of that baby. When I finally got to Aunt Grace's house, at least a mile away, she was shocked to see me and even more surprised to learn why I was there. She gathered her 5 children up and walked with me back home, where I'm sure they all had a good laugh at my expense. Needless to say, Nancy remained with our family. Some of the best toys came from Troy Furniture's trash bin. Big wooden crates that furniture and appliances came in were made into playhouses, and even a ship one time with several rooms and corridors. I remember our cousin, Jeanette Kynard, came to visit from Charlotte, and we played in that ship. We were so excited we could even feel the boat swaying. I graduated from Troy High School in 1946 and went to Pfeiffer College for 1 year. In 1948, I married Bill Norris. We had 2 children, Nan and Chip. Bill died in 1977. In 1983, I married Clyde Elder and moved to Richmond, Virginia, and lived there 11 years. We moved to Pinehurst in 1994. My brother Carson and his wife Doris live there. My brother David and wife Marilyn live in Troy. My sister Jane and husband Jerry Grimes live in Siler City, and my sister Nancy and husband Wyatt Helsebeck live in Lexington. So we are all in close proximity and are back to our roots. I'm so happy to have been raised in Troy, Montgomery County, North Carolina. I can't think of any place I'd rather call home. And that is the end of that story. And we have time for one more. And the title of this story is We Still Haven't Gotten to Florida by Alfred V. Fox, Sr. I was born on August 11th, 1923 in Candor. I was delivered at my parents' home on the corner of Main Street and Whiskey Road by Dr. J. M. McMillan. My parents were Bynum and Julia Ann Nall Fox. My father was a sawmiller, carpenter, and auto mechanic. He helped to build the Carolina Theater in Pinehurst, North Carolina. My mother was a homemaker. There were 6 children in my family: Willie Anon, John Albert, Margaret Catherine, Gladys Elizabeth, Herbert Graham, and me, Alfred Vernon. We lived in a 6-room wood frame house. We had electric lights but did not have running water. We got our water from a 40-foot well. The toilet was outside, and the Sears and Montgomery Ward catalogs were always handy to have. My mother cooked on a kerosene stove. She washed our clothes in a cast-iron washpot in the backyard. On March 2nd, 1927, I looked out the window and saw that the snow was up to the windowsill of our house. We had over 3 feet of snow. That was the deepest snow ever recorded for this part of North Carolina. On January 29th, 1929, I was walking back to school and got run over by a Model A Ford driven by Dorothy Blue. The weather was real bad and it was snowing. I was taken to High Point Hospital, which was the closest hospital at the time. 9 days later, I woke up and found that my right leg was broken. My closest playmates were Ledbetter Harris and Claude Burkhead Jr. A lot of our toys were made out of scrap wood. Many of my clothes were hand-me-downs from my cousin in Florida. Once a year, I looked forward to getting a package from him. In the early 20s, my father started Fox Garage in a building beside our house. He was the first to have electricity and a radio in Candor. Every night he would put the radio on the porch of our house, and people would come to listen to Amos and Andy and Lub and Abner. After the program was over, everyone would talk and have a good time. I remember when the Depression hit the United States in 1930. Most of the banks closed and money was very scarce. The Hoover cart was the transportation of the day at that time. Most families farmed or had a garden in order to have food to eat. I still have the hand plow that my mother used to plow her garden. In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt won the presidential election. He started the WPA and CCC camps that gave people money and made money a little more plentiful. In 1935, I got my first job. I worked in peaches for John C. Munn, a farmer and peach grower. In 1936, I reached the age of 13. That year, I went to work with my two brothers and my father at Fox Garage. In 1937, Bill Payne and Wash Turner robbed the Bank of Candor. Paul Clark was president of the bank, Theo McCaskill was manager, and Ruby McCaskill was the teller. For entertainment during my teenage years, we had square dances on Saturday nights, hay rides, and corn shuckings. We went to the movies and we went swimming in McCallum's Pond. We went to parties and we walked the rails. I graduated from Candor High School in 1941. There were 41 members of our class. I went to Elon College to study business administration. While I was in college, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. We were at war. On January 11, 1943, I was drafted into the Army. I went to Camp Croft for my physical and came back home for a 1-week furlough. On January 18, 1943, the day I was to return from my furlough, we had a real bad storm. The wind blew down the Baptist church, downed trees, and damaged a lot of homes. Our bus left Troy at 7 a.m. for Fort Jackson, South Carolina. I stayed at Fort Jackson for 3 days and was shipped to the desert in California for my basic training. There I was attached to the service troop 4th Cavalry. Later, we reorganized to become the 4th Cavalry Group, which consisted of the 4th Cavalry Squadron and the 24th Cavalry Squadron. I was in HQ, and service troop of the 24th Cavalry Squadron. On December of 1943, we were sent to England. That was my first Christmas away from home. On June 16, 1944, we landed on Utah Beach, France. After the St. Lo breakthrough, we regrouped and were attached to the 7th Corps 1st Army. We were in 5 different battle campaigns in France, Belgium, and Germany. I received my discharge from the Army on November 9, 1945 at Fort Bragg. Robert Kearns brought me to Candor from Fort Bragg. When I returned home, I went back to work at Fox Garage. At night, we would keep the front of the garage open, mostly to sell gas. However, it became the loafing and gathering place for the farmers and others. Everyone would talk over their troubles and do a lot of gossiping. Whenever the water bucket was brought in, they all knew it was time to call it a day. When I met my wife, Ann Deaton, she taught 7th grade at Candor High School. Her parents were bringing her back to Candor one Sunday afternoon in October 1950. They gave out of gas before getting there. Someone brought Ann and her mother to town to get gas. They stopped at Fox Garage to see if they could get gas. I was the one holding down the fort that day. We talked some, and then I took them back to their car with the gas. That is how we met. I called Ann later and asked for a date. She accepted. Our first date was on Halloween night. After a short courtship, we decided we would go to Florida as man and wife. We were married by Ann's father at the Ellerby Baptist Church in Ellerby on June 17, 1951. It rained and rained that day. We got to Charleston, South Carolina on our honeymoon, and that was as close to Florida as we got. To this day, we still haven't gotten to Florida. Charlie McDonald, who married Dorothy Blue, the lady who was driving the car that hit me in 1929, came to the garage one day. He handed me a small paper. "Here is your wedding present," he said. I opened the paper and read, "In 1929, you let a woman run over you. Don't let it happen again." The paper was signed by Charlie. I still have the note. Our first child, Elford Vernon Fox, Jr., was born March 17, 1952. Our second child, Janice Ann Fox, was born November 22, 1953. Our third child, John Carlton Fox, was born May 5, 1956. Elford married Shirley Moore from Ashboro. Janice married Steve Allen of Greensboro. John married Darlene Lamons from Candor. They have two sons, Michael and Jason. I worked at Fox Garage, which was owned by the three Fox brothers, Albert, Herbert, and me. We were in the truck, car, and tractor business. After working for 62 years, I retired from business on September 1st, 1988. Since retirement, I have done a lot of volunteer work. I volunteered 5 years for the Red Cross and 10 years for the Moore Regional Hospital. I have a small workshop that I enjoy. Ann and I also travel some each year. I have lived in Candor most of my life. During the years between 1930 and 1960, I remember when Candor had 9 grocery stores, 2 hardware stores, 5 general merchandise stores, 4 garages, 9 places that sold gas, grocery and hardware stores sold gas, 3 car dealerships, 2 tractor dealerships, 4 cafes, 2 drugstores, 2 meat markets, and 2 airports. I live on Whiskey Road, which got its name back in Prohibition days. Just about everyone from Candor to Hoffman made their own whiskey, so that is how the road got its name. As I reach the grand old age of 76, it is hard to realize how many changes occur in a person's lifetime. Life goes on. The end. And here's a picture of the side of the Fox garage. Very nice. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed getting to hear these stories from olden times, times before my day, definitely. It's always interesting to me to hear these stories. And to compare it to what my life is like today is very different. Thank you so much for being here. I really hope that you have a wonderful day, and I will see you again really soon.